I never thought war would come to my farm. Not like this. The sound of splintering would shatter the peaceful afternoon. I dropped the grocery bags on my truck bed, heart pounding as I sprinted toward the creek. My boots skidded on the muddy path, barely keeping me upright as I slid down the embankment. 3 men in yellow vests were swinging sledgehammers, their faces set in grim determination. My bridge, the one I had built with my own hands, was being torn apart piece by piece. A woman stood nearby, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, stumbling onto the bank. The woman turned slowly, her pearl necklace glinting in the afternoon sun. She had the look of someone used to being obeyed. Expensive navy pantsuit, sharp eyes that sized me up like an insect under her shoe. "Mr. Marshall, I presume?" Her voice was clipped, authoritative. "I'm Eleanor Harrington, president of the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association. This structure violates our community's standards." I blinked, heat rising to my face. Community standards? This is my land. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Our survey indicates otherwise. The creek is a property line, and any structure crossing it requires HOA approval." One of the workers smirked as he pried up another plank, sending it tumbling into the rushing water below. I clenched my fists. That bridge is how I access the back part of my farm. My family has owned this land for 4 generations, long before your HOA even existed. Eleanor handed me a document, stamped, official looking. "You'll find everything in order." My hands shook as I scanned the page. I had checked every property map when I built the bridge last year. The creek cut entirely through my land. But according to this survey, the HOA had redrawn the boundary, conveniently claiming my bridge and a portion of my land. "This is wrong," I said, voice tight. "Your survey is wrong." Eleanor sighed, like she was dealing with a petulant child. "Mr. Marshall, we understand change is difficult, but Sycamore Heights has standards to maintain, property values to protect." I wasn't stupid. I saw my neighbor Diane standing on her deck, phone raised, recording the whole thing. She had complained last month about my tractor being an eyesore. I had a feeling this was payback. I forced myself to stay calm. "I want to see the original survey." Eleanor checked her watch. "Feel free to bring your concerns to our next board meeting. First Tuesday of the month. 7 p.m. sharp. Residents only, of course." She emphasized that last part, making sure I knew I wasn't welcome. Behind her, my bridge groaned, the final support beams giving way. Wood splashed into the water, and my stomach sank. That bridge wasn't just a way to cross a creek. It was a connection to my land, a piece of my family's history. Eleanor's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then back at me, suddenly interested. "Actually, since you're here," she said smoothly, handing me a business card. "My associate has been meaning to contact you." I read the name. Sycamore Development Group. "My husband's company," she said. "They're very interested in discussing the future of your quaint little farm." And just like that, everything clicked. This wasn't about a bridge. They wanted my land. I pocketed the card. "My family survived the Great Depression on this land, Mrs. Harrington. We survived droughts, floods, and everything in between. We'll survive you too." Her smile tightened. "We'll see." As she walked away, something caught my eye, a small camera mounted on Diane's fence, angled directly at my property. When had that been installed? And who exactly was watching? That night, my kitchen table was covered in old property maps. I scrolled through county records on my laptop, double-checking every survey. I knew I was right. The creek was mine, but if the HOA had faked their survey, how far did their corruption go? A knock at the door made me jump. It was late, too late for visitors. Through the window, I saw an older man in a rumpled suit, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I opened the door. "Mr. Marshall? Who's asking?" "Frank Cooper," he said. "I was Sycamore Heights surveyor. Until last month." I frowned, and Frank exhaled. "May I come in? You need to know what they're planning for your land." By morning, the stakes had risen. Literally, Someone had driven wooden stakes with orange flags into my land, marking off a new boundary that cut 20 feet into my farm. And that wasn't all. Trash was dumped along my side of the creek. Old furniture, broken appliances, garbage bags ripped open. As I began cleaning, I caught movement. Diane, standing on her deck, coffee in hand, watching. When she saw me looking, she smirked and disappeared inside. An hour later, a county vehicle pulled up. A woman in uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Marshall, I'm here about an environmental complaint," she said. "Illegal dumping in a waterway." My jaw clenched. "You've got to be kidding me." She looked uncomfortable. "We have photographic evidence." Diane's camera. They were framing me. I tried to argue, but it didn't matter. A $5,000 fine was issued on the spot. Then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Board meeting tomorrow. We'll discuss a fair price for your troublesome property." I crushed the citation in my fist. They thought they could push me out. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The next day, I visited the county records office. I needed proof. Anything to challenge the HOA's fraudulent claim. The clerk hesitated when I asked for the original survey. "That's complicated." "How so?" She leaned closer. "Let's just say Eleanor has friends in high places." By the time I left, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about my farm. This was a systematic land grab, and I wasn't the first victim. I arrived at the HOA meeting just as Eleanor was finishing a speech. I walked straight to the podium and held up their fake survey. "Since you decided my creek is yours," I said, "I figure that makes me a resident." The room erupted. Some were confused. Others looked angry. Eleanor forced a smile. "Mr. Marshall, this is a private meeting." "Then why are your surveyors trespassing on other people's land?" Murmurs spread. A man in the front row stood. "I'd like to hear what he has to say." That's when I realized I wasn't alone. There were others. And together, we were about to take the fight straight to Eleanor's doorstep. The meeting ended in chaos. Eleanor banged her gavel, shouting about order and misinformation. But the damage was done. The room buzzed with uncertainty, and for the first time, I saw cracks forming in her polished control. As I left, a man caught up with me outside. Mid-50s, thick mustache, sharp eyes. "I'm Marcus," he said. "Been here for 15 years. You're not the only one who's had problems with Eleanor." That got my attention. "What do you mean?" Marcus glanced around before lowering his voice. "Meet me tomorrow night. Sunset Drive, House 42. Come around back." He walked away before I could ask anything else. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the stakes driven into my land, the smug look on Diane's face, the way Eleanor's expression faltered when I held up that fake survey. I wasn't just fighting for my farm anymore. Something bigger was happening here, and I was going to find out what. The next evening, I parked a block away from Marcus's house and cut through backyards like I was sneaking into enemy territory. Inside, I found 15 people gathered in his basement, homeowners, farmers, even a couple of former HOA members. "We've been compiling evidence for months," Marcus said, spreading documents across a folding table. "But we needed someone willing to take the first punch in public." I recognized some of the faces. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had filed complaints about her demolished treehouse. The Patels, whose garden decorations had been removed for violating aesthetic standards. An older man, Mr. Jenkins, who had been forced to sell his home after relentless fines. They all had stories. Eleanor's HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were systematically forcing people out, especially those who owned land at the edges of the neighborhood. One woman, Margaret, handed me a thick folder. "Look at this." Inside were copies of property records. Every time Sycamore Heights expanded, it followed the same pattern: harassment, fabricated violations, devaluing properties, then a suspiciously fast sale to Sycamore Development Group, Eleanor's husband's company. "They're not just running an HOA," Marcus said. "They're running a racket." A cold realization settled over me. This wasn't just about my bridge. It was about control, expansion, power, and they'd been getting away with it for years. Not anymore. By sunrise, Eleanor struck back. Someone had diverted the creek again, sending water straight into my lower field. I waded through knee-high floodwater, my winter wheat drowning before my eyes. A county water management truck rolled up just as I started clearing the sandbags. The same officer from before stepped out. "Mr. Marshall, we've received another complaint." I threw down my shovel. "Let me guess, unauthorized water diversion?" She didn't meet my eyes. "Your actions are affecting drainage in Sycamore Heights. You're being fined for unauthorized alterations to a waterway." I nearly laughed. "You think I did this?" She looked uncomfortable. "I'm just here to enforce the county's regulations." Regulations Eleanor had twisted to work in her favor. As the officer handed me the citation, I noticed someone watching from the edge of my property. Thomas Harrington. He was standing beside his sleek black SUV, arms crossed, his face smug. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Noon, deadline approaching. Offer drops 10% with each citation. They were trying to squeeze me out. Financially, legally, emotionally. I took a deep breath, forcing my rage into something sharper. They thought I'd break. They were wrong. That night, we met again at Marcus's house. "We need proof," I said. "Something that'll hold up in court." Margaret raised a hand. "I can get that." She explained that older county records, ones that couldn't be tampered with, were stored 2 counties over. She'd take a team to retrieve them. Mr. Patel nodded. "My wife and I will interview former residents. Many were pushed out under pressure. If we can get their stories recorded, it'll show a pattern." I finished. Then Miguel, the Rodriguez's son, spoke up. "I've been looking at the HOA's website. Their meeting minutes don't add up." "What do you mean?" I asked. Miguel turned his laptop around. The timestamps on their documents were altered. They'd been backdating approvals for permits after the fact. My stomach tightened. That was big. "We use this," I said. "All of it." Over the next 3 days, we gathered evidence like an army preparing for war. Margaret retrieved original property maps that proved Eleanor's survey was fraudulent. The Patels recorded testimonies from homeowners forced into foreclosure. Miguel hacked into HOA meeting logs, pulling files that showed Eleanor knew her land grabs were legal. And I rebuilt my bridge. Legally, with cameras recording every second. If Eleanor wanted another fight, I was ready. I got the county's approval, paid for every permit. And this time, I wasn't alone. Neighbors showed up with tools and supplies. Some brought food, others just offered a hand. Even people still living under Eleanor's rule sneaked over to help after dark. Diane appeared on her deck, scowling. You know she's just going to tear it down again. I wiped sweat from my brow. Let her try. The bridge took shape over 3 days. Sturdier, wider. Solar lights lined the railing. A small bench sat midway across. A symbol. Mrs. Rodriguez stopped by with lemonade. "She's going to hate this," she said, grinning. I smiled back. That's the point. On the final day, I carved a sign at the entrance. Marshall Crossing, all welcome. And I meant it. But Eleanor wasn't finished yet. The very next morning, Eleanor arrived. Not alone. She brought 2 HOA board members, a private security guard, and, of course, Diane. "This structure violates Covenant 7.3, she announced, thrusting papers at me. "Remove it within 24 hours or face legal consequences." I didn't even glance at the papers. "This bridge is fully permitted. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here. We'll see about that." The security guard stepped forward, but I pointed at the cameras. "Everything's being recorded, including the fact that you're trespassing." They backed off, but I knew this wasn't over. That night, an emergency HOA meeting was called. I received a text from Margaret. "Eleanor's pulling permits for heavy equipment. She's planning something big." I exhaled slowly. If she thought she could bulldoze her way out of this, she was about to learn otherwise. Because now, I wasn't just fighting for my farm. I was fighting for every person she had ever bullied. And I wasn't fighting alone. The morning after Eleanor's threats, my phone rang before sunrise. Turn on the news. Margaret's voice crackled through the line. I grabbed the remote and flicked on the TV. There she was, Eleanor Harrington, front and center in a breaking news report. President of Sycamore Heights, HOA accused of land grab scheme. The anchor announced, new evidence suggests falsified surveys, fraudulent property claims, and systematic harassment of homeowners. I exhaled slowly. It was happening. James Rodriguez, the journalist I had met at Marcus's house, had gone public. He had everything. The interviews, the documents, the hidden meeting minutes Miguel had uncovered, and people were paying attention. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. You have no idea what you've started. I ignored it. I had bigger things to focus on. Within hours, the story had spread across social media. Homeowners from other neighborhoods reached out, sharing eerily similar experiences. This wasn't just a Sycamore Heights problem. Eleanor had done this before, and now she was exposed. That afternoon, I was stacking hay in my barn when I heard the rumble of engines. I stepped outside just in time to see a convoy of construction vehicles rolling toward my farm. At the front of the line, Eleanor. She wasn't hiding behind lawyers or county officials this time. She was sitting in the driver's seat of a bulldozer, her face twisted in determination. I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. She wasn't just trying to scare me. She was here to destroy everything. Neighbors gathered on the edge of my property, whispering, watching. James Rodriguez was there too, camera rolling. She revved the bulldozer's engine, her eyes locked on me. I stepped forward. Eleanor turned around. Her lip curled. This farm is an eyesore. I tightened my jaw. You don't have the authority to do this. Eleanor laughed. I built this town, Marshall. You think some newspaper article can stop me? She hit the gas. The bulldozer lurched forward, right toward my newly rebuilt bridge. Adrenaline surged through me. I sprinted toward the creek, waving my arms. Eleanor, stop. But she wasn't stopping. She was going faster. Just as the bulldozer reached the bridge, I saw the ground beneath her shift. The creek had been flooded too many times. The soil was soft, unstable. The massive machine tilted. Eleanor's eyes went wide as the front wheels lifted off the ground. For the first time, I saw real fear on her face. Then, with a deafening crack, the embankment gave way. The bulldozer tipped sideways, crashing into mud with a thunderous splash. Eleanor scrambled out of the cab, covered in dirt and panic. That's when the sheriff's car pulled up, lights flashing. A deputy stepped out, reading from a document. Eleanor Harrington, you're under arrest. She spun toward him, still breathless from the fall. Do you know who my husband is? The sheriff just smiled. Not anymore. The deputies cuffed her as cameras clicked, capturing the downfall of Sycamore Heights Queen. I watched as they loaded her into the squad car, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Eleanor's arrest sent shockwaves through Sycamore Heights. Within hours, her husband Thomas released a public statement. My wife acted alone, he claimed, distancing himself from her crimes. I had no knowledge of her activities with the HOA. No one believed him. By the next morning, county investigators had frozen all permits for his development company. And then the real avalanche hit. Bank records were leaked. Emails surfaced. Everything we suspected was confirmed. Eleanor and Thomas had systematically used HOA regulations to force homeowners out, buying up properties at half their value. 11 houses, millions in profits. And they had planned to take 6 more, including mine. The HOA board panicked. Half of them resigned immediately. The others lawyered up. Sycamore Heights residents, once blindly loyal to Eleanor, turned against her overnight. I had no idea. Diane whispered one evening, standing on the edge of my property. I folded my arms. You didn't want to know. She had the decency to look ashamed. But at least she was here now. And that was something. The court case moved fast. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged surveys, the fake violations, the coerced sales. The judge didn't just rule against Eleanor. He ordered all unlawfully acquired properties to be returned to their original owners. Every single one. Homeowners who had been forced out were given the option to buy their houses back at the original sale price. And me? The county officially restored my property boundaries. The fake survey was erased. My land, every inch of it, was mine again. Eleanor sat stone-faced in the courtroom as the ruling was read. 5 years in prison. Heavy financial penalties. Her empire was gone, and she had no one to blame but herself. A new beginning. The HOA was dismantled. The people of Sycamore Heights formed a new community council, one that actually listened to its residents. And for the first time, we weren't divided. We were neighbors again. 6 months later, we gathered at the creek. Together, we built another bridge. Wider, stronger. The children painted colorful handprints along the railing. The Patels brought samosas. The Rodriguez family played music. Even Diane showed up. She handed me a lemonade and sighed. I was wrong about you. I smirked. About what? She hesitated, then gestured at the bridge. About what makes a neighborhood valuable. I looked at the people around me. People who had once been strangers, now bound together by something stronger than property lines. Community. This was the real victory. I glanced at Margaret, who was watching the kids play. You know what's funny? She said. None of this would have happened if they hadn't torn down your first bridge. I laughed, watching the fireflies dance over the water. Some things need to be broken, I said, before they could be rebuilt properly. And as twilight settled over our town, I knew one thing for sure. Eleanor had tried to build an empire of walls and rules. But instead, we built bridges. And this one would stand for generations. The night after the bridge celebration, I stood at my kitchen window, staring out at the fields. The battle was over, but the scars remained. For the first time in months, my land was truly mine again. No more fraudulent violations. No more fake citations. No more threats hanging over my head. But while I had won, Sycamore Heights still had a mess to clean up. The HOA was officially dismantled, but something had to take its place. People were scared of what would happen next. Without an HOA, won't the neighborhood turn into a disaster? Some worried. What about property values? Who enforces the rules now? I wasn't sure how to feel when Marcus invited me to their first neighborhood meeting. I still wasn't part of Sycamore Heights. My farm stood just outside its borders. But I had fought alongside these people. And now they wanted my input. I entered the meeting hall, expecting resistance. Instead, I was met with nods and handshakes. Even Diane, once my worst critic, gave me a tight smile. Marcus stood at the podium. We need a new way forward, he said. Not an HOA that controls us, but a community council that works for us. People murmured in agreement. We still need some basic guidelines. Diane said, standing up? Without standards, things could spiral out of control. I folded my arms. Rules should help people, not hurt them. Diane hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. To my surprise, the room broke into applause. A new committee formed that night. Marcus, the Patels, the Rodriguezes, even Diane. Their first act? Removing Eleanor's oppressive regulations. For the first time, Sycamore Heights belonged to its residents, not a dictator in a pantsuit. And as I left the meeting, I realized something. I had spent months fighting for my farm, but in the end, I had helped save a whole neighborhood. Spring arrived early that year. The frost melted. The land turned green again. And one morning, Marcus knocked on my door. We want to build another bridge, he said. I raised an eyebrow. What's wrong with the one we just finished? Nothing, he grinned. But this time, we want one on the other side of the creek, linking your farm directly to Sycamore Heights. I blinked. You serious? Marcus nodded. After everything we've been through, it's only right. No more walls between us. 2 weeks later, my neighbors, gathered by the water, hammers and saws in hand. This time, the bridge wasn't about defiance. It wasn't about war. It was about unity. As we worked, I saw families laughing together. The Patels handed out homemade food. The Rodriguezes played music. Kids raced around with paintbrushes, decorating the railings with colorful handprints. Diane, of all people, showed up with a stack of wooden signs. Figure we should make it official, she said, handing me one. I read the words and smirked. Marshall Crossing, all welcome. It was the perfect name, the perfect message. Because this wasn't just my land anymore. It was ours. Eleanor's trial was the biggest event the county had seen in years. She stood in court, her once perfect posture slightly hunched, her confidence shaken. Her lawyer tried everything, claiming she was a victim of misinformation, that she had only been following procedures. But the evidence was overwhelming. Emails, bank records, testimonies, every fraudulent property acquisition, every fake violation, every manipulated survey. It was all laid out before the judge. Eleanor and Thomas turned on each other in the courtroom, each blaming the other for the corruption. But the judge wasn't fooled. The court finds substantial evidence of fraud, criminal property damage, and conspiracy, he announced. Additionally, all properties acquired through unlawful means must be offered back to their original owners at purchase price. Eleanor's face paled. Her empire was gone. Her mansion was sold to cover legal fees. Her assets were frozen. And as a final blow, the judge handed down her sentence. 5 years in prison, plus financial penalties that would take decades to pay off. As they led her away, she caught my eye. "This isn't over," she hissed. "My lawyers will bury you." I simply smiled. "No, Eleanor, it's over." And this time, she had no power left to fight. Months passed. With Eleanor gone, Sycamore Heights changed. People who had once lived in fear of the HOA started taking pride in their community again. The Rodriguezes launched a website, documenting everything we had uncovered about Eleanor's corruption. It became a resource for other neighborhoods battling HOAs across the country. Margaret started helping homeowners file legal claims against predatory HOAs, using our victory as a blueprint. The Patels turned their once targeted garden into a public space, open to everyone. And as for me, I went back to farming, back to early mornings and long days, back to tending the land that had been in my family for generations. But things were different now. When I drove my tractor across the bridge, I didn't just see my farm. I saw a community that had fought for itself. I saw neighbors who had become friends. And I saw a future that no longer belonged to corrupt HOAs. It belonged to the people. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret stopped by the farm. "You know," she said, "none of this would have happened if they hadn't torn down your first bridge." I smirked. Funny how that worked out. She looked toward the new bridge, watching the kids race across it. "You think Eleanor will ever try something again?" she asked. I shook my head. "Not from a jail cell." Margaret chuckled, then grew serious. "This could have ended differently. You could have lost everything." I nodded, but I didn't. She studied me for a moment. "Why do you think you won?" I thought about it. About every person who had joined the fight. About every resident who had stood up against Eleanor's tyranny. About every bridge, literal and metaphorical, that we had built. "I didn't win," I said finally. "We did." Because at the end of the day, strength wasn't in money or power. It wasn't in HOA regulations or threats. It was in the people who stood together. Eleanor had tried to build an empire of walls and rules. But instead, we built bridges. And those would stand for generations.